Thank you very much indeed on behalf of David and I and the task force for joining us today. I'll keep the introduction pretty short because I think your reputation very much precedes you, so I think you're not someone who needs a huge introduction. But thank you very much for making time today. I think the purpose of the task force is really to try and understand new business models, how they're evolving, and what that means right across the board for others as they're searching for new models of innovation. I think Better Place is a great example of that. I think maybe just to set the context for this, David, do you want to say a couple of words, either at the beginning or the end, about Mexico and the task force and how that's going? Do you want to jump in now, or do you want to jump in at the end?
Yeah, I'll jump in quick now if everyone can hear me. So just to update everyone, we had a great meeting in Mexico, got a lot of new energy in the task force, and I just want to share one area where we did a deep dive, continuing the theme of the task force. So if you look at the task force in the last year, it's a lot of sharing experiences, now taking it to another level of doing a dive into specific business models, looking at what are patterns we're seeing, understanding possibly key drivers of a business model, and then taking those key drivers. So in this case, we did a deeper dive on shared business models like Zipcar, for example. Possibly there's some similarities with Better Place in terms of sharing batteries, but if you take Zipcar and other models of sharing hotel rooms or apartments for hotel rooms, what makes those business models a success? Is it excess capacity? Is it a high capex? Are you solving some complexity in maybe maintenance? But what makes that industry work for a shared model versus other industries, as an example, and then understanding those drivers and seeing how they could be applied to different industries, different verticals, different regions. So it was a lot of fun, and it seems like a nice evolution and kind of area of focus that we're going to take the task force. So with that, Shai, again, to echo what Peter said, we're excited that you're joining us today and look forward to hearing your presentation.
So, of course, yours. I think the one thing I would say for anyone joining the task force is that as we go, as you have questions, there is an instant messenger feature, a chat feature. Feel free to post those. We'll fire some of those at you, Shai, at the end, and look forward to a rich discussion.
Thank you, both David and Quentin. I hope you can hear me, just if you can acknowledge that I'm not talking to myself.
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Shai.
Super. So as a former young global leader, I don't know how you become former young global leader, because I still feel young and I'm fairly global. Maybe I'm not leading anymore. But as a former young global leader and as an alum, it's exciting to share with you some the progress that we've done and the concepts and the thoughts behind one of the probably the most exciting projects that was born and executed within YGL as a framework, and then took a life of its own around 2008. We were just historic references. We started in 2005 with a question that was sort of generic from the professor on what are you going to do to make the world a better place, which actually ended up being our name, by 2020. And the answer that I came up with became my personal project at YGL, and that was if we could make one country go without oil. And I was a software guy, so I had absolutely no knowledge about neither cars nor oil at the time. In a way that can be replicated, that can be driven by customer demand and not by an edict by the government, that can be replicated in every country around the world, so it's not unique to one place or another. And that can be profitable, so that we can find massive investments that would like to come into this plan. Then we will make the world a better place by virtue of the fact that it will sort of self-propagate at that point in time. We built a plan. It started from me. It ended up with a bunch of guys that were sort of helping and reading and criticizing. One of the members, Andre Zarur, became a sort of the technical observer, co-author on the process. And then by 2007, we were able to define this in a way that got both the government of Israel and Renault excited enough to sort of handshake on building a project, which in turn by 2008 got funded to execute this plan in Israel, 3 months later in Denmark, and later on in Australia and in other parts of the world. We define ourselves as an electric vehicle network operator, and if you think about what an operator does, the best example we all know around us are the likes of cell phone operators, airlines, utilities, that provides a service that connects between the complexity of a network, the need to source assets for a very long time, and the ability to actually retail the service to consumers in ways that hide the complexity of what needs to get done for them to sort of use on their day-to-day life. Our mission is to end the world's dependence on oil, and in order to do so, we intend to make cars, electric cars, that will be both cheaper and more convenient than gasoline cars, with the thought process that if we offered consumers the option to drive a car that is both better for them, cheaper for their pockets, and better for the world, most of them would do so. In our offerings, effectively not the car itself, even though in some places we are the market makers, but we really build the network. In a sense, we're the AT&T of electric cars, and we use our technologies, which I'll describe a bit, to provide that kind of a service, to provide a service of effectively electric miles, electric kilometers, depending where you are in the world, whether you measure in miles or kilometers, electric miles to consumers in a fantastic car that
is convenient. Is not available. At the tone, please record your message. When you have finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
And so in order to provide this network, obviously you need a car and a battery. We've signed an agreement with our first partner, Renault, and we bought a ton of cars. We placed an order for 115,000 cars. It's a $3 billion order to build the first mass-produced electric vehicles that actually is cheaper to the consumer than its equivalent gasoline or competitive gasoline offering. We buy batteries and manage them as a big asset that we switch between cars. And the secret of what we've done is the separation between the car and the battery. We own the battery, the consumer owns the car, much like oil companies own the oil wells while consumers own their gasoline cars. We build a network of battery switch stations across an entire country. The battery switch stations cover the country from end to end and allow those electric cars to actually not only charge at home and work as they do usually, but also enable them to drive any distance they want beyond the range of the battery by switching the battery at a station and going without delays, without needing to sit there and wait for the battery to charge up. We offer software inside the car that manages this entire network for the consumer, and we offer software in the back office that allows us to manage this massive asset and provide a service level that is better than what you get with gasoline cars. This is not a concept anymore. Today it's a reality. If you look at this map of Israel, and I know Israel for a lot of people is not something that they're familiar with, but sort of top to bottom on this chart is about the size of the state of New Jersey. For those of you who are from the West Coast, the big part on the west side of that map is the size of the San Francisco Bay Area, if you want to think about it that way. Going from northmost point to the southmost point is about a 5-hour, 6-hour drive. West-east actually is much shorter, less than the distance of a battery. But north-south, you need more than one battery to get through comfortably. We now have 40 of these stations in various different stages of construction across the country. Some of them are operating already, some of them in testing, some of them are still in construction. Similarly, we've done a similar approach in Denmark. It's slightly smaller and easier geography to manage, mainly because you've got 3 islands, and so all you need to do is get to the bridges. But a network of about 20 odd stations covers the entire country of Denmark. We have charge spots, thousands of charge spots across the country, mostly in residential areas, in offices, some in public areas as well, with a network that is managed and controlled across the country. We also reached a massive market awareness. Probably almost every Israeli knows about Better Place, knows that there's an electric car, and now that the cars are driving on the road, lots of hits, lots of Facebook likes, as well as a lot of physical likes on the road, people stopping you and sort of thumbs up on the road that this is good and happening. Approximately 100,000 people already visited our visitor center, drove the car, had the experience of what it means to go electric. And one of the things that is most amazing to people, we've signed 400 corporations across Israel that between them represent almost 50% of new car sales in the country, to convert their entire employee fleet within the next 4 or 5 years. The numbers we're aiming for in the first 12 months to sort of go up from about 1% market share to about 4% market share, which makes this the first electric car that will go mainstream and not a niche product, with a massive ecosystem support it. What it does is it creates an exponential growth curve on the number of miles driven. We've reached 100,000 kilometers in the first month. We're on our trajectory to reach 1 million kilometers 4 months later. And this is going probably from 1 million to 10 million kilometers in less than a year, and 100 million kilometers less than a year later. It all goes to that basic fundamental posit of you got to get to consumers with an offering that is disruptive to the existing price proposition, unique selling proposition that is the mainstream market offer today. We didn't go to consumers and say, hey, would you like to be good people? Would you like to help the world? We came to people and said, would you like to get a better product than you get today? With the assumption that if you offered consumer a car that will be more convenient and more affordable than today's cars, they will pick it up after a certain fear factor subsides, which is normal with early adoption cycles. And then they will be willing to pay parity to gasoline on a per mile basis when they drive it. In other words, if you offered me a $10,000 car that feels like a $25,000 car, I'll pick it. And then I'll pay you in the US about $4.50 for a gallon equivalent. In Europe, about €2 for a liter equivalent to drive it. As long as you locked that price, and I don't need to worry about any of the other components that require to drive an electric car. What it does is actually a very interesting phenomenon. If you look at today's offerings of electric vehicles, and this will be familiar to a lot of initiatives, and if you plugged out electric vehicle and you plug in something else in your domain, in your initiative, what you see is that new disruptive offerings usually come outside the comfort zone of where the market wants to purchase. So if you look at the gray area on the left bottom side, we define convenience and affordability in the following way. Any person you ask today, how many times do you stop to refuel, would tell you about once a week. And when you ask them, how long do you spend at the gas station, say, about 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. And when you ask them how much do you pay for a car, they'll say, I'm sort of an average car buyer, so I'll, about $20,000 in the US, about 15,000 euros in Europe for a new car. And that defines the domain where 98% of the transactions happen. Now, of course, lots of people buy outside that domain. A Ferrari is obviously not in that domain. It's not a convenient nor an affordable car, but it comes to satisfy a smaller segment of the market. And in that smaller segment niche of the market, you find people who can compete with a Ferrari, with a $100,000 Tesla, and still be able to make a good offering. But if you try and get into mainstream, if you try and change the world, in other words, you try and end the world dependence on oil, you can't offer something that is outside that domain. You have to be within the domain to get mainstream buyers to adopt in massive amounts at a short period of time, given that our target is to save the world by 2020. With our offering, we actually need to deal with the same realities of today's market. And so there's no magic. If you look at a Toyota Corolla at about 15,000 euros, 10,000 of them are to make the car and 5,000 to distribute it. Same would happen to a Nissan Leaf. It's the same 10,000 euros to make the base car without the battery, and the same 5,000 euros to distribute. You probably have a bit of a market education fee that goes to advertising and educating dealerships, etc. But you also have an 8,000 euro battery that has to go inside. And what the market sees is a $32,000 car, 25,000 euro car. If you also make very few of them, like Ford decided to do, you have to put a low volume cost, which happens to most initiatives around the world when you just start. And that's an extra cost, 30,000 euro cost, or $40,000, $42,000 Ford Focus, which then becomes also not very attractive and justifies the reason that it's really low volume. Some people try and get smart, and what they do is they sort of shorten the distance of the battery, which is what the Volt did, and add a second powertrain with hybrids, but you still end up with a $42,000 car, and again, you're beyond the range of desirability that we saw before. You're not in the affordability spectrum of what the mainstream consumer buys. What we did in looking at it is we separated the ownership for the car and the battery to reduce the cost of the car. We also, by separating the car and the battery, allowed ourselves not to fall into a trap of a reduced resale value every time the technology for batteries improves. Actually, your car residual value, when you want to resell it, becomes better the more the technology advancements on batteries continue to happen. And we assume that they will continue to happen or even accelerate over time. We also added high volume purchasing, which significantly lowers the price of a car. And there is a cost reduction in the orders of thousands of euros when you go from buying 10,000 cars to 100,000 cars, and again, thousands of euros when we go from 100,000 cars to 1 million cars. By adding the battery switch, we also solved the problem of range. And I can tell you from my own experiences, in the last 3 months, I drove more than 3,000 miles. I needed to switch about 4 times. If I drove 3,000 miles in a gasoline car, I'll probably stop at a gas station about 10 times during that same period of time. So I actually do have a more convenient electric car than a gasoline car. And then we added a lot of technology to the smart charging capabilities, basically creating a smart charge grid that allows us to create almost a virtual private network for electrons for our cars that allows us to buy electricity from renewable sources and clean up also the intake on the grid by shifting the time in which we buy the electricity from the grid. The combination of all of these things actually creates a very interesting effect. It allows us to take a car that you saw before, the Corolla, and look at it in a bit of a different perspective now. When we look at it not just as the cost of making the car, we look at it over its life, 15 years, we see that that car will consume north of 60,000 euros for gasoline, for refueling it in the next 15 years. On the other hand, a car that has a battery separated from it will cost the same to produce, but will need only 2 batteries over the same 15 years and a bit of electricity. And the combination of that is about 20,000 euros. The overall delta between the cost of operating a gasoline car and an electric car is north of 50,000 euros over the life of the car. And when you look at that 50,000 euros, we're the first ones who are able to capture it, again, with the assumption that we priced the car cheaper to buy than the gasoline equivalent. And by doing so, we can ask the consumer to pay us almost as much as gasoline for that period of time, not from one consumer, but from the entire chain of consumers that will own it over its life of 15 years. As an operator, in effect, what happens is we have a very simple business model. We don't buy the cars, we buy the batteries, and we buy the electricity. The consumer buys the car. We build a network that knows how to intelligently mix the batteries and the electricity in order to sell kilometers on a long-term subscription contract. long-term being 3-4 years, in which we lock the price for the consumer. We do not pass to the consumer the fluctuation of energy costs that they're used to with gasoline. But in doing so, we effectively build a network that allows them to continue to consume a car the way they did before. They buy a car, they own the car, they can lease it or finance it if they wanted to. There's no residual drop on the value of the car, hence financing organizations are willing to finance it. And they pay for the miles on the go. They pay for the miles effectively as they consume those miles. And in doing so, we become the operator that makes that car very desirable, convenient, and affordable. So in a sense, we're AT&T and not Nokia, or if you want to go back to the original days of gasoline, we're Standard Oil, not GM. We live in this space because we're able to put a car, the first car that we got, right in the corner of at least as convenient as the Fluence, as the Toyota Corolla, and at least as cheap as the Toyota Corolla. And in a lot of markets where we have incentives, we're actually pushed left on both convenience as well as on affordability. So we're actually cheaper and more convenient than those cars. Over the years, as battery technology improves, as the volume improves, we can continue to shift left into that box, into the middle of that box. And when we get to the middle of the box, in particular to a magical point in the car industry, when we're able to price this car cheaper than a second-hand gasoline car, we believe the entire market can kick. In other words, when we get to the point where the question to consumers is not, do you want to be a green person or a dirty emitting person, but the question becomes, would you like to buy a new car for the same price as an old car? That becomes a no-brainer, and the masses start to shift. And so that's effectively our story. We have raised to date, and this is a YGL project that I think raised more money than a lot of companies in history. But we raised close to $1 billion, 750 million of them in equity, and about $250 million in debt, at a very high valuation, mind you, for a company that's just launching north of $2.25 billion to date, mostly due to a very simple model, and I'm shifting quickly forward so that we can actually see it. The cost of building one of those networks is actually very, very cheap. To build a network across a country costs, so across Israel or a country like Holland, for those of you who want another reference, costs about 100 million euros to put the network across the entire country. Of that 100 million euros, 2/3 are financed by the vendors, and 1/3 is financed by equity. The cost of equity to put a network in the ground for Holland is less than 1 day of gasoline for the country. In other words, with an equity investment of 1 day of gasoline use in a region, in a country, in a region like a Bay Area, or in a region like Europe, for 1 day of equity investment, 1 day of gasoline equity investment, you can put a country with a full network across that region that enables consumers to get a cheaper, more convenient gasoline, electric car than gasoline, and the payback is very, very quickly. And so I want to sort of wrap the story on sort of how we work, in effect, jump to, and this is, now it's actually not just Israel, Denmark, the next targets are Western Europe. You're seeing Holland, which is next, and the taxi station is coming up in there. We now have projects in China, in North America. The replication part is starting right now. We picked Australia as the third market, mostly because people believe that we're only good for small islands. And so we picked a big island just so that they are comfortable with the fact that it would work in large locations. And the reality combined with the claim, the reality of actually putting this in the ground and seeing it work, and the claim that you can get off of oil, has been very, very appealing to a lot of countries. We talked about how this can actually work. One is replication. So for very simple process. Taking a country like Israel and replicating it now to another country is a 12 to 18-month process that we very easily can do in other places and are starting to do in places like Holland. The second question that I got as we were preparing is, what is unique about this model, and how can it be, what ideas, what concepts can be taken to other domains that are not replicating a better place in another location? And I think that one of the things that we've done is we looked at which asset needs to be shared and which asset not necessarily needs to be shared in order to go to scale. And so while this is, we've seen a lot of programs that are fantastic in the domain of car share, and I think car sharing answers the need of a very important segment of people who don't drive a lot of miles, and as a result of that don't really necessarily need to own a parked car most of the time. And that is a broader perspective on sharing. If you looked at the battery, which was hindering the adoption of electric vehicles, and you looked at a segment that used most of gasoline in any country, and that's the segment that drives north of 15,000 miles a year, 20 to 25,000 kilometers upwards a year, that segment uses 50% of gasoline in the country. And for that segment, owning a battery meant not being able to go the distance without the inconvenience of parking on the sideline. It also meant a significant degradation in the value of the car as you go out to try and sell it, because the battery dies faster than the car itself. By separating the car and the battery and doing a sharing model just on the battery with a full ownership model on the car, we created, in effect, no pun intended, a true ownership hybrid model. And that hybrid ownership model actually responded better to the needs of customers who wanted to keep the comfort of what they did with cars. And in similar ways, you can look at your models and find what needs to be shared and what needs to be owned by the customer, and eventually understand what needs to be subsidized and financed upfront. We are, in effect, owning a big asset, the battery assets, and we subsidize the ownership of the car by retaining a high-value operating contract with the customer. A recurring revenue model on miles generates a lot of margin that can then be applied back into the ownership of the car in a similar fashion to what we've seen with smartphones, where high data usage subsidizes the ownership of the smartphone and the cost of building that smartphone itself. So think of your models, separate what needs to be owned, what needs to be shared. Look at how do you actually price the service to the customer in as close as possible model to what they buy today. They buy miles today, even if they think of them as liters or gallons. And then see how you can apply finance and financial tools in order to reduce the capital acquisition cost required on the upfront to get subscribers onto your plan or your networks or your shared plans across multiple different assets that you own. Those are the key tips that I can provide you, and then I'd love to take questions if you want to sort of clarify more on what we've done.
Shai, thank you very much indeed. It's Peter again. So that was fascinating. Thank you. We've got some questions coming in. So let me put a couple to you, and I've got one or two I'd like to ask myself. So the first one is a more detailed question, which is, what's the break-even point at which the lifetime carbon footprint of the Fluence is lower than the Corolla? Is it when it rolls out of the factory? Is it at 50,000 miles? That's coming from Rob.
I think I'll give you the image that you got to keep in mind, because there's been a lot of pushback on carbon footprint. I'll give you three things you got to keep in mind. One, this car, to make a Fluence that drives on diesel and to make a Fluence that drives on batteries, 90% of the parts, other than the battery itself, are practically the same. Okay? So there is no break-even comparison to just say, well, you know, I need to see where that car is at the 50,000 miles or not. We are not really replacing somebody who used to go on bikes. We're replacing somebody who used to go on diesel before. If you want to understand the balance on the battery, a battery over its life will replace order of magnitude of 20 to 25,000 liters just over its first life, and probably about 50,000 liters of gasoline if you take into account secondary life usage inside cars. So keep the following image in mind. Imagine 50 liters of gasoline, and now put next to it 250 liters size of battery. Now, burn the gasoline, and imagine all the pollution that comes out of that 25,000 liter tank of gasoline. And now recycle the battery, and imagine 80% of that battery goes back to another battery right after that. And if anybody ever asks you which one is more polluting to the environment, give them that image so that they understand what's the effect on the environment. Now, when people come back and say we want to do well-to-wheel analysis, I'll give you just one number that you got to keep in mind. The refineries in Israel that are used to refine gasoline, to refine oil into gasoline, if you actually took the energy used for refining, not the energy embedded in the oil itself before it was refined, just the refining energy for the gasoline used in Israel, with the refining energy, you'd be able to drive 3/4 of the cars in Israel if they went electric, just on the refining energy itself. In Denmark, to put another picture in your mind that you can then use with people who ask that question, we're going to be driving every car in Denmark on a power purchase agreement that we have, coming from 750 windmills that are built into the North Sea. Those 750 windmills will provide all the energy required, and in effect building a virtual oil field. It's virtual because it uses no oil, but it's an equivalent to an oil field because it can drive those cars in perpetuity from the moment the cars are on the road, the network is on the road, and the windmills are in the ground or in the sea. So I hope that gives you a clarity on some of those.
I think that's really helpful, Shai. I think that's clear, and it's I think that's a critical issue. And I think there's a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 for you to take in sort of rapid fire. There's 2 or 3 questions around the consumer, and this was going to be my question as well. You talked about the shift to a model where the consumer has to think about the life cycle of a vehicle and to the 15-year view of their purchase and their use of a product. And to what extent have you seen resistance? How have you overcome that? And I guess in
hold on, Dave. I want to make sure we're clear. We don't ask the consumer to think of the 15-year horizon. The consumer doesn't look into it. They buy a car, and what we're basically telling the consumer, why don't you buy a car because it's cheaper to buy today and it retains its value better tomorrow. Mm-hmm. We're not asking them to look at TCO calculations or anything like that. We're basically saying, look at this sticker. You're getting a Camry for the price of a Corolla.
Yeah. And is that a message that's easily absorbed and understood? I mean, is it easier in a B2B environment than in a consumer conversation?
Look, it's a very easy B2B conversation, as we said before, with the fleets, because the CEO hears, I'm going to go green. The CFO hears, I'm going to save 20% TCO. Right. And the employee hears, I don't really need to care about plugging or unplugging or anything like that. I just get a great car. It's also assisted by a lot of different policies. So, for example, the Dutch government told the employee, look, if you buy a gasoline car, you have to pay taxes on the equivalent of 2.5% of the cost of the car. If you pick electric, you don't need to pay taxes. So lots of local policies help you sort of send the message and embed it into people's minds. But by and large, in the B2B environment, all you need to tell them is, look, your lease for the employee is the same, and the cost of driving is 20% less on the per mile basis and is capped, whereas with oil, it's not capped.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's another set of questions. There's a couple of questions coming in around the vertical integration of the exchange stations in the model, Shai. And our question, it's an extension of that, which is, do you expect to remain vertically integrated, or is that capex that you can ultimately shed over time?
I think it's a great question. We don't know how the industry eventually will shift. I can tell you, we started off extremely non-integrated in the sense we didn't go out and build a car on our own. If you think about the first point of this integration, we have a car maker that is building a car. They actually went out and put a massive investment, 4 billion euro, into building lines of products, electric cars, some of which are relying on the existing of a network that wasn't there when they started. In a sense, we sort of both did, and if you build it, they will come. We built a network for a car that didn't exist, and they built a car for a network that didn't exist, and we're now meeting together, and luckily the tunnel from both sides actually got to the same point. But that was a big decision that we had to decide up front, and that is, what are you good at and what you're not good at. And we decided that the odds of us making a good solid car with all the processes that are required in order to make a safe car that is scaled and delivered and maintained and warrantied and sourced, etc., are slim to none. And we passed that part to somebody whose main job was that. They did the same thing. For them, building a network of switch stations in the ground, dealing with regulatory frameworks, building the software was impossible. And so they also disintegrated in the sense that they didn't want to go vertically integrated. Now, whether at the end of the day those stations are owned by us or owned by Shell or BP, I don't think that really is determined. We may see in some cases that they will sit inside gas station networks, or for that matter, they can sit in the back of a supermarket network or something else, and then we may either own them or we may either lease the service with somebody else owning them.
And how much, I mean, David's just asking this question, I was thinking it as you were talking, I mean, how far back up the chain do you go? I mean, you used the example of AT&T and Standard Oil. Would you go as far back as being an energy provider in certain situations, or does that go beyond the core competence?
Absolutely not. We will be the biggest energy buyer. We sign long-term power purchase agreements from the cleanest source we can find that is reasonably priced.
Makes sense. And when you look at you talked about this issue of how you scale it, how you take it beyond, a geography that you've already been very successful with in Israel. I mean, one of the criticisms is that obviously it's a very unique situation. There are some, as you've said, overlaps with other regulatory environments, other contexts, other geographic situations. But are there barriers and limits that you found to the model in other political contexts, in other business environments? I mean, did you just talk a little bit about some of the challenges you faced and how you've overcome them?
Yeah, look, I would say the first prohibitor that we've had to date on most locations was skepticism. We make a huge claim. Give me one day of gasoline, I'll get you off of oil, is a huge claim to any head of state. Right? And a lot of them sort of skeptically scratch their heads and say, okay, show me that somewhere else, and then come back and ask for one day. If there's a higher propensity to get a week of gasoline when you've proven it somewhere else than to get one day of gasoline before you proved it.
Right.
So by and large, think of that umbrella. Now within that umbrella, you also have different behaviors in different locations. And in places where you have a lot of car manufacturing locally, then you have a very tough union discussion with people who sort of carry huge political powers, and usually the manufacturing unions, in particular the automotive unions, sort of push on government in places where cars are being made, and that's the same in Michigan as it is in Munich, right? So it's not much different regardless of where you are. In other places like China, this is sort of a different discussion where most of the conversation is around how do we make this indigenous, how do we reinvent this as Chinese technology and not buy it from some other country. In places where you have openness to other technologies, a lot of the conversation is sort of, can you come here? When can you come here? What do I need to give you in order to make it happen? And then how much risk appetite they have as a state, or where they are in the political process before elections, after elections. That's most of what we see in those other locations. When this thing works, and you got to understand, if you think of Israel as a cell, right? If you think of Holland as a cell, with that cost of about 100 million euro, sort of 30-40 million dollars worth of equity required. A cell is San Diego, a cell is LA, a cell is San Francisco, a cell is Seattle, a half cell is Portland, and if you connect those cells with one freeway, all of a sudden you got the west coast of the United States. If it works in one cell, there is nothing that makes it not work in 5 cells, right? And so that's basically what we've shown in Australia. If you can do Israel, you can do Melbourne. If you can do Melbourne, you can do Sydney. If you can do Sydney, you can do Brisbane. And all of a sudden, you've got 90% of the Australian cars covered.
Yeah. And you made the point about resistance from potentially the unions and from the automotive industry. One of the questions here is asking a similar question in terms of the lobbying and the pushback and the tougher political environment in places like the US from the oil lobby as well, so more from the supply side. Has that been a barrier?
I think we had we had a tougher time cracking the automotive guys than we had in dealing with the oil guys. In an interesting twist, our number one investor actually is Mr. Big Oil in Israel. They own the refineries in Israel. Our first investor in Denmark is Dong Energy, Danish oil and natural gas. So you look at our collection of investors, they include the likes of the Tish family, which is pretty heavy investor in oil supply chain. On the other hand, when you look at the automotive guys, there's been a lot of denial throughout this process that this is actually going to work. And that denial comes from sort of the resistance to change in the automotive industry, which is known historically to sort of have one car company create a segment and a lot of car companies to become fast followers to that segment. And we've seen it before, both in the introduction of the Japanese cars into the US, followed by the Koreans. We've seen it before with the introductions of SUVs, where most of the market said they won't succeed, and then everybody chased that same market. We've seen it with minivans. We've seen it with smaller vehicles, smaller engines. So it's pretty natural for the automotive industry to sort of sit back, wait, see the vanguard, usually one car company, go through, see their volumes, and then make a decision to do the same.
And another question here, you made the point about your model focusing on the battery and on power and your desire to buy the cheapest, cleanest fuel you can. Question here, how do you assess that, and how do you make the trade-off between profit and the environmental impact when you're looking to source at scale?
When we buy sort of on an average about 10 cents a kilowatt hour, given the power purchase agreements and our willingness to be an intermittent buyer, and if you look at it roughly around the world, it averages out to about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. If somebody came up and said, you need to pay a premium for clean in the range of about 1 cent a mile, give or take 1 cent a mile, so 15 cents a kilowatt hour, we would buy. If somebody came up and said you need to pay $1 a kilowatt hour for clean sources, it would break our model. And
is that a conversation that goes on with the consumer, either the B2B or the end consumer, or with the government conversation that you mentioned?
We expose it to consumers in a variety of different ways. Again, consumers have no problem of paying sort of an extra cent a mile. As a matter of fact, some of them would pay more than a cent a mile to make sure that the source of energy from us is clean. Others don't really care. And depending on the location, we see different social motivations for being an adopter here. So we joke about it that we have the two Al camps. We have a camp of Al Gore fans, and we have a camp of Al-Qaeda haters. The Al-Qaeda haters Some of them are actually climate change deniers, but as long as you don't use gasoline, they're your fan.
Yeah. Yeah. And which is the stronger driver, do you think? I mean, do you...
Depending on location.
The real decision makers?
Again, depending on location. There's no doubt that in Denmark it's the Al Gore fans, and in Israel it's the Al Qaeda haters.
Yeah.
That have the majority. Both of them are sort of affecting one another. But in the U.S., depending on whether you're at the coast or in the middle of the country, you'd see a very different discussion. It's sort of Democrats and Republicans.
When you look at the last 3 to 5 years in this space, Shai, and when you look at the next 3 to 5 years, what have been the big disruptive innovations, disruptive technologies to date? And if you had to make a bet in the next 2 or 3 years, what would they be?
Can you repeat that again? I missed you.
So if you look at the last 3 to 5 years in terms of disruptive technologies and innovation around mobility and in your sector, what have been the big 2 or 3 that you think have changed the game? And then looking at the next 3 to 5 years, where would you place your bets?
So look, we've had a lot of people that claim that the secret will be some secret magic battery that will know how to solve this problem. I always point back to Tesla in 2008 that used laptop batteries, and they still do. And I'm sure that the guy who designed the laptop batteries didn't think, I got to make sure as I design the laptop batteries that they'll be able to drive a car at 3.9 seconds from 0 to 60. And I think that shows that there's not a lot of disruptive innovation in the battery technology. What happened over the last decade, I think, and that's the key that most people understand, is that batteries continue to improve as a result of mobile devices. And they continue to improve on 3 fronts. One, the cost per unit, per kilowatt hour. 2, the longevity, if you want, of the battery. So if before the batteries would last for about 200 to 300 charges, now they last for about 2,000 charges. And the last one is you've got more density in the battery. You combine all these together, you get a factor overall of about roughly 20 to 30x improvement on the cost of the battery per mile in the last decade. On the other side, oil went up from $10 to $100. And so there's a 10x against oil and a 20x in favor of batteries. Put the two together, that's a 200x shift. The problem is nobody looked at the batteries as consumables. And so you have an effect that is not much different than Moore's Law. It's not driven by the number of transistors per square inch, but it gives you the same kind of effect. The cost per mile of a battery on a per mile basis is actually going down by a factor of 50% almost every 18 months now. You aggregate this enough times, and you got very, very disruptive pricing to a massive battery all of a sudden inside the car. That was lost on the car guys because they kept on seeing the same cost of a component, but they didn't see the cost of it as a cost per mile. They didn't see the shared business model as a disruptive force. When you look at the shared business model and you compare it all of a sudden to gasoline, which the car guys again didn't see at all because they didn't get any penny from the gasoline, all of a sudden you've got enough disruption that you can flip the equation and an electric car is cheaper. But nobody saw that in the industry. In a certain degree, this is similar to what happened to Google. I mean, at some point it was reasonable enough to index the entire internet, but nobody figured it out. And when they did figure it out, nobody knew how to price it correctly. And the price wasn't to sell you the engine. The price was to sell you the click. And what we say in my previous industry is Google is just like Excite, only with the right business model. Better Place is just like an electric vehicle, only with the right business model. It's the same technology, it's the same trajectories, it's the same continuous innovation. There's no disruption here. And I don't think that you'll see any massive disruption that shifts us away from this model. In a sense, if tomorrow a battery came in that was massively cheaper, heavier, better density, and having longer life cycles, it would improve this presentation to the point where I'd be able to offer you tomorrow a car that would be cheaper than a second-hand car.
And what about the impact of the speed of charging?
Again, what most people don't realize is when somebody tells you that there is a magic battery that does 400 miles and can be charged in a lab in 5 minutes, if you take the amount of power that needs to go into a battery that does 400 miles, that's about 100 kilowatt hours, and you try and charge it not in an hour or 3 hours or 6 hours, but in 5 minutes, you need to plug into that 100 kilowatt hour battery 12 times in kilowatts, because it's 5 minutes instead of 60 minutes, which is an hour. In a sense, you need to plug into that car a megawatt power line. I want to, again, images, you need to plug into that car the feeder into the Empire State Building. And even if the battery knew how to take the feeder into the Empire State Building, I'm sure you wouldn't want to hold it. And you wouldn't want to plug it into your car with the kid sitting in the back even for 5 minutes. And the grid wouldn't know how to handle 1,000 of these cables hanging around going on off randomly. And so our solution is not one that says the battery is the limitation. It actually looks at a system overall, all the way from the utilities to the kid in the back, and saying if all limitations, because if I'm trying to put more power into a shorter amount of time, then I need a bigger hose of electrons feeding into it. So if you look at all of it from a systems perspective, we don't see anything disruptive coming around the corner that says, well, you don't need all of this in order to get adoption. I think actually most of the innovations we're seeing in the lab, projecting forward 5, 7, 10 years, would actually necessitate more of our solution, not less of our solution.
And so I think we're coming up to the hour now, Shai, and I want to respect your time, and this has been fascinating, exactly what we wanted to get into. As a final closing question, really the purpose of this task force, you know, when David and I set it up, and I think as it's grown with the YGLs, is to try and put out there some of the models people are using to disrupt industries that really are successful, commercially scalable, and that is, you know, to your exact brand, are making the world a better place. When you think to the core of your model, and you've described that essence, and you've talked about the importance of business model, you know, whether or not it's the Excite versus Google, or the AT&T versus Nokia, or the Standard Oil versus GM. I mean, when you think about your business model, what other industries do you think are conducive or ripe for thinking about disruption in this way?
So first of all, when you look at the climate problem, I think there's an essential need to use similar business models for replacement of wasteful usage of energy. And I'll give you an example. Pricing a LED light that has a 15-year life at $6 compared to 50 cents for an incandescent light bulb actually sends the wrong message to the buyer. What you want is somebody that actually comes up and says, I will buy your lighting bill, and I will put the LED lights for free in there, and you'll continue to pay me what you used to pay for incandescent light bulbs to light up your house. And you don't need to worry about it. This LED light never ends. It just goes on and on and on. And we'll make a ton of money on that model. If you think of trying to sell people a heat battery to go with your air conditioning, right? A thermal battery that goes with air conditioning, and actually sell you the thermal management unit apart from the air conditioning unit, and telling you you'll save that money within the next 3 years. What you need is somebody to come in and say, can I please pay you to install this unit in there, and you pay me what you used to pay for heating and cooling your house? and you don't need to worry about it. I'll put it in there for free, or I'll pay you to put it in there. And I think we need to shift away from models where we pass to the consumer the upfront capital expenses. We got to think of models where we basically come in and say, I'm going to buy your bill by putting this asset inside. You can't get away from me anymore, but I'm going to make sure that I live off the margin, not live off the upfront unit. And you see it with the likes of Bloom Energy, who came in and said, if you've got a lot of needs for power, just pay me 10 cents a kilowatt hour. I'll put this unit here. You don't know how much it costs. It just sits there. And it gives you cleaner energy at 10 cents a kilowatt hour. What do you care how I do it? And the magic that happens inside is not your problem. I think we got to see a lot of these guys, especially in the energy sector, where the consumer is not aware of capital expense. They don't know how much it costs to build a power plant. They never saw that. They don't know how much it costs to build a drill ship to drill in the middle of the ocean. They never see that. They just know that they pay for a mile or they pay for an hour of light, and that's all they know. In a lot of cases, they don't even know how to calculate that. We need to educate them on that cost. We need to separate those costs, and then we need to find a way to aggregate that payment and replace it with capital and make a profit on as we go at it. Because if we don't make profit, you won't see a lot of other companies that get $1 billion before they sold the first dollar.
Shai, as we wrap up, we basically, we're starting to do this with all the speakers, and this is the final question. In 3 sentences, describe your business model, its unique innovation, and its impact in improving the state of the world.
We buy batteries, we buy electrons, we sell miles, and we put a network to mix batteries and electrons into miles with a very, very high margin. The uniqueness is we separated between car ownership and battery ownership, and by doing so offered for the first time, a car that doesn't go on gasoline, that is cheaper and more convenient than any gasoline car out there in the market. And the impact is measurable change from oil-based economies to oil-free economies within less than a decade of the moment we enter a market. And in a sense, we will free the world from its dependence on oil, which is extremely destructive to the planet, to the people, to the prosperity of the world.
Shai, that's a fantastic ending to, I think, one of the highlights in the series to date. I'm sure all of the YGLs, the task force members, and certainly David, myself, and Quentin would like to give you a big thank you and keep up the good work.
Thank you, and everybody here, go save the world. We need you.
Thank you, Shai.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.